When Sonny the dog with a heart of gold suddenly started scratching the floor and barking like his life depended on it, Ben thought it was just another odd moment. But that night, something deep inside told him not to ignore it. What they discovered would change everything. And it all began with a single growl in the night. Chapter 1. The Growl in the Night. The town of Millfield, tucked away in the snow-glazed forests of Vermont, looked like a painting in December. It was one of those sleepy places where everyone knew each other by name, and winters came early with a kind of bone-deep silence. Snow-blanketed rooftops, and the trees stood motionless, their limbs heavy with frost. Nights came quickly here, often by 4 in the afternoon, cloaking the world in darkness and leaving only the warm, golden lights from old wooden houses as beacons of life. Ben Parker, 52, lived in one of those house-esque, aging 2-story cabin on the edge of the woods. Once a decorated firefighter with shoulders that still held the memory of weighty gear and collapsing beams, Ben now carried a quieter kind of strength. Tall, with sun-worn skin and streaks of gray in his thick, swept-back hair, he had the kind of eyes that held stories some spoken, many not. Since retiring early after a rescue that left a scar on his right shoulder and an even deeper one on his soul, Ben had embraced solitude. But he wasn't alone. His most constant companion was a golden retriever named Sonny. Sonny was 5 years old, but you'd never guess it from the puppy-like enthusiasm he showed when it came to snow. His coat was thick, the color of burnt caramel, and in winter it puffed out like he wore a lion's mane. Sonny had soft brown eyes, always alert, and a calm demeanor, except when something stirred his instincts. Ben often said, "That dog's got a sixth sense and then some." That evening, just past 9, Ben sat in his old recliner near the fireplace, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. A battered copy of Call of the Wild lay open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Outside, the wind howled low and steady, a lullaby of ice and fur. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. And Sonny was stretched out nearby, nose nestled between his paws, completely still. Until he wasn't. Suddenly, Sonny's ears perked up. He lifted his head sharply and stared at the far corner of the room beneath the window, just where the old floorboards met. A deep, low growl vibrated in his throat. Ben glanced up. "What is it, boy?" Sonny stood, hackles rising. Then, without warning, he dashed across the room, barking sharply, and began to scratch fiercely at the floorboards, claws clicking against the aged wood. Ben stood, setting his mug down on the windowsill. Hey, easy," he said, approaching, half annoyed, half concerned. Sonny didn't stop. He growled, pawed, scratched with determination, as if something under those boards needed to be dug out, no matter the cost. Ben crouched down beside him. The floorboards didn't look warped or chewed. He pressed a palm to the wood, cold, perfectly normal. "It's probably a mouse," he muttered, though, even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Sonny had seen mice before. He didn't react like this. The room fell quiet for a moment. The fire hissed softly. Outside, the wind reeked against the glass. Sonny sat back on his haunches and let out a soft, almost pleading whine. He looked up at Ben, eyes wide, tail stiff behind him. Ben's chest tightened. It had been years since he'd felt this uneasy knot, since the last building fire he'd fought, where he had to crawl through smoke and screaming beams to find a trapped little girl. That same gnawing feeling in his gut was back. He reached out and ran a hand along Sonny's neck. "Okay, buddy, I'm listening." He stood and fetched a flashlight from the hallway, clicked it on, and knelt again. Carefully, he examined the floorboards. No signs of damage. But Sonny began whining louder, now pacing in small circles, occasionally returning to the same spot and pressing his paw to it. Ben pressed his ear to the floor. Nothing. He closed his eyes, listened. At first, there was only silence then, the faintest, almost imperceptible sound. A soft shuffle. He jerked his head back. What the hell? Sonny barked sharply. Ben stood quickly. His hands were trembling now. He hadn't touched his toolbox in months, but he went to the coat closet, retrieved it, and returned to the living room. Sonny was waiting, his eyes locked on the floor. Ben pulled out a flat pry bar and hesitated. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. But something in Sonny's eyes told him, "Do it." The old boards groaned as Ben worked the bar into the seam and gave it a pull. The wood splintered slightly, dust rising in the beam of the flashlight. He pulled again. Another board came loose. And then, nothing. Just darkness beneath. Until he heard it again. A faint, trembling breath. He shone the flashlight into the space and froze. Chapter 2. Secrets Below the Floor. Ben held the flashlight with a trembling hand, its beam flickering slightly as if it too were afraid of what it might reveal. The space beneath the floor was barely large enough to fit a child, and yet, there in the dust and shadows, lay a boy. His limbs were drawn close to his chest like a wounded animal, and his hair matted and the color of dark straw clung to his pale, dirty forehead. He didn't flinch when the light hit him, nor when Ben whispered, Hey there, buddy." The boy's eyes slowly opened wide, round and hollow. Eli. That's the name Ben would later hear. But right now, this was just a frightened child who looked more like a ghost than a living thing. He couldn't have been older than 6. His cheeks were sunken, lips cracked. He wore a faded gray hoodie 2 sizes too big and thin pajama pants smeared with dust and cobwebs. Sonny let out a low whimper and inched forward, nose twitching. The boy's gaze shifted to the dog, and for the first time, something flickered behind the fear, something like hope. Sonny lay down, slowly crawling toward the opening, his tail sweeping gently across the wooden floor. The boy didn't move, but his breathing, ragged and shallow, seemed to ease ever so slightly. Ben reached in slowly, hand outstretched, his voice calm and low like he was back in a smoke-filled building talking someone through a rescue. "You're safe now, okay? I'm not gonna hurt you. Neither will Sonny. Let's get you out of there." There was no response, but after a long, heavy silence, the boy shifted. One bare foot, then another. His limbs moved stiffly, as if he hadn't stood up in days. When Ben helped lift him from the crawlspace, the boy clung to him not tightly, not like a child seeking comfort, but as though his body no longer knew what to do on its own. Ben cradled him for a moment, then gently wrapped a fleece blanket around his tiny shoulders. They sat together by the fireplace. Ben added more wood, the flames crackling louder than usual. The boy flinched at the sound. Ben noticed. Every little noise made the kid twitch, eyes darting. This wasn't just fear, it was trauma. Sonny rested at the boy's feet, occasionally nudging his nose against the child's ankle. Ben didn't push. He just sat nearby, sipping lukewarm tea and letting the silence do what it could. Eventually, the boy reached out and touched Sonny's fur. It was the smallest of gestures, but Ben knew then they had a shot. In the morning, Ben called the only person he trusted with something like this, Maeve Holloway. Maeve lived on the outskirts of town, a quarter-mile down a snow-covered trail. In her late 60s, Maeve was a retired nurse and local herbalist, known for her quiet kindness and warm gingerbread. She was short and plump, with silver hair always pulled into a loose braid. Life had softened her voice, but not her mind. Maeve had never married. She'd once been engaged, but her fiancé, a paramedic, had died in a crash decades ago. Since then, she'd poured herself into caring for others. When Maeve answered the door, wearing a wool shawl and dusted in flour, she took one look at the boy clinging to Ben and ushered them inside without a word. Her home smelled of cinnamon, pine, and old books. "Sit him near the fire," she said, already fetching a kettle. "He looks frozen to the bones." While Ben explained carefully and without overwhelming detail, Maeve checked the boy over with gentle hands. "He's dehydrated, malnourished, but no broken bones. The bruises, they're old. This child's been through something no one his age should." They got a name that afternoon, Not from the boy he still hadn't spoken, but from a small bracelet tied around his wrist, worn and hidden under the sleeve of his hoodie. It read E-L-I. Eli, Ben murmured. That your name, kiddo? The boy blinked, hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Maeve sat beside him, holding a cup of warm broth. You don't have to say anything, sweetheart. Just sip this, nice and slow. Ben spent the rest of the day calling local authorities anonymously, trying to cross-check missing child reports, but nothing matched. There were no alerts, no recent news about a child named Eli. Which made it even stranger. No family, no police records. It was like the boy didn't exist. That night, back in his own home, Ben set up a bed on the couch with extra blankets. Eli curled up against the far armrest, legs tucked close. Sonny lay beside him, eyes half open, keeping watch. Ben sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Who could have hidden a child in a crawlspace in his home? His house had belonged to a distant cousin before he bought Ived, never renovated the floor. Could someone have used the place before? He thought back to the old keys. The second door in the cellar that didn't seem to go anywhere anymore. Questions piled up like snow against the windows. Just before dawn, Eli whispered something. Ben wasn't sure if he heard it or dreamt it. He said he'd come back. Ben froze. The voice was so quiet, so fragile, like the creak of an old hinge. Ben didn't respond, not immediately. He just sat beside the boy, hand resting on Sonny's back. You're not alone, Eli, he said softly. Not anymore. Chapter 3. Buried Memories. The morning after Eli's whisper left Ben sleepless. The sun struggled to break through a heavy blanket of gray clouds. The frost clung stubbornly to window panes, and the chimney smoke from Maeve's cabin spiraled into the crisp Vermont air like slow-moving ghosts. Inside her cozy kitchen, the boy sat bundled in a thick knitted sweater 2 sizes too large. Maeve had offered him oatmeal with cinnamon, but he barely touched it. His fingers played with the edge of the ceramic bowl, while Sonny rested nearby, head on his paws, ever watchful. Ben stood by the window, sipping weak coffee and trying to stitch sense out of the frayed thread that had become his life. The boy's voice echoed in his head. He said he'd come back. Whoever he was, Ben intended to make damn sure that never happened. Later that afternoon, as Maeve gently brushed Eli's tangled hair and hummed an old Irish lullaby, Ben carefully went through the boy's clothing more for answers than out of suspicion. In the pocket of the faded hoodie, hidden deep beneath a torn lining, he found something unexpected. A photograph. It was bent, corners frayed, but still clear. In it, a woman in her early 30s smiled awkwardly at the camera, one arm around a younger Eli who looked barely 4. Behind them stood a rundown trailer with rust along the seams and a faded number on the mailbox, 79. The woman had dark circles under her eyes and the hollow look of someone clinging to something that kept slipping away. Her hair, long and curly, was tied into a messy ponytail, and a faded tattoo peeked out from her collarbone. Ben stared at her, a strange mix of familiarity and dread knotting in his chest. He flipped the photo over. In faded ink, 3 words had been scribbled. Mom, stay strong. He showed the photo to Maeve, who looked at it quietly, lips pursed. She's not local, she said. But I've seen that number before, 79. That's on Ridgeline Road, the old trailer park near the quarry. Ben nodded slowly. Place is mostly abandoned now. Still, she said softly, might be worth checking. That evening, while Eli dozed, curled up with Sonny on the couch, Ben drove his old pickup through winding back roads to the edge of town. The Ridgeline trailer park was a shadow of whatever life it might have once had. The entrance sign hung sideways from one rusted chain, and most of the trailers looked like they hadn't seen life in years. A few, though, still stood upright, windows patched with cardboard or plastic. One had smoke rising from a stovepipe, but the rest sat silent under the falling snow. Ben parked and approached trailer 79. The door hung slightly ajar. He knocked, waited. No answer. A quick scan of the surrounding lot showed no tire tracks newer than a week. The place was likely abandoned. Inside, he found broken furniture, empty bottles, and an overwhelming smell of mold and old cigarettes. But what caught his eye was a child's blanket on the floor, Superman, faded, and torn. And next to it, on the table, a prescription bottle with the name Lydia Rowe. It was dated from 3 months earlier. The address matched the trailer. Back at Maeve's, he shared the name. Maeve's eyes narrowed slightly. Rowe. I remember that name. There was a Lydia Rowe arrested 2 years ago. Drugs. Neglect. She had a boy. I didn't know what happened to him. Ben nodded grimly. Neither did the system, it seems. Later that night, Maeve shared something else over warm cider. I don't mean to stir more worry, she began. But a few weeks ago, I noticed a black van with out-of-state plates driving slow near my property. It circled the bend twice. Didn't stop, didn't wave. Ben set down his mug. How long ago was that? 3, maybe 4 weeks. Could have been when they hit Eli, or someone scouting out where to put him. Maeve's expression tightened. You think someone used your house? Ben shook his head. The crawl space wasn't disturbed recently. Dust patterns would know. They hit him a while ago, then they left. Maybe they meant to come back, maybe not. Or maybe they got spooked, Maeve added softly. In the following days, Ben began piecing more together. He drove to the county courthouse and requested public records on Lydia Rowe. Her trail was thin. Arrested for possession and endangering a minor in 2021, released 6 months later into a rehab program. No follow-ups. Her parole officer filed a missing persons notice 3 months ago, then silence. On the way back from town, Ben stopped by the local diner for coffee and a sandwich. The waitress on duty was Janine, a round-faced woman in her early 40s with a loud voice and a quicker smile. She'd worked there forever and knew everyone's business, usually before they did. She leaned over his table with a refill and nodded toward the file folder beside his plate. Looking for someone, Ben? Kind of. She squinted at the name. Rowe, huh? That woman used to come here, always late at night, real jittery, smoked like a chimney. She had a kid, too quiet little guy. Sat with a coloring book and never said a word. Ever see them with anyone else? Yeah, big guy. Bald, tattoo on his neck. Gave me the creeps. Called her Lyd. Janine frowned. Last time I saw them, she looked terrified. He ordered for both. She didn't say a word. Ben filed that away, thanked her, and left a generous tip. That night, after tucking Eli in, Ben sat by the fire, the photo of Lydia and Eli resting on the table beside him. Sonny lay on the rug, tail twitching in his sleep. Ben stared at the flames and wondered what kind of fear would drive a mother to hide her son and disappear without a trace. He also wondered if the man Janine had mentioned tattooed, controlling, was the same one Eli feared. The one who said he'd come back. Ben looked toward the couch, where the boy now slept without twitching. He knew safety wasn't something Eli could feel overnight. But with every gentle nudge from Sonny, every quiet meal Maeve prepared, every night passed without fear, it was a start. Chapter 4. The first words. The snow outside had thickened, muting the world into a slow, white hush. Inside Maeve's cabin, the fire crackled steadily as the kettle on the stove began to whistle low. The warmth was soothing, and even the shadows on the walls seemed softer. Eli sat cross-legged on the woven rug, Sonny beside him, tail twitching gently as the boy ran a small wooden comb through his golden fur. It was Maeve's calm. She had handed it to Eli earlier with a quiet nudge, her eyes saying more than words ever could. Ben watched from the armchair near the hearth, coffee untouched in his hands. He had grown used to the quiet, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that weighed down the air. But this moment felt different. Eli's shoulders, usually drawn tight, were relaxed. His fingers no longer trembled. And then, just as Maeve placed 2 mugs of cocoa on the side table, it happened. Eli spoke. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was unmistakably him. "Sonny soft," he said, his voice barely louder than the fire's whisper. Ben's breath caught. Maeve froze halfway into her seat. Eli didn't seem to notice their stunned silence. He kept brushing Sonny's fur, murmuring, "He makes it quiet, inside." Maeve blinked, slowly sat down, and smiled without speaking. Ben knelt beside the boy, keeping his voice low and steady. "That's right. He's a good listener, too." Eli looked up, his eyes more alive than they'd been since the first night. He opened his mouth, paused, then said, "My name's Eli." He hesitated, then added, "Mom called me Eli." Ben gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's a good name. I'm glad to know it." Eli's gaze lowered again, and his lips moved as though searching for something safe to say. Then came the words that chilled the air around them. "The man. He was mean. He hurt Mom," he said. "He said he'd come back for me." Ben didn't speak. Not yet. He looked to Maeve, who was already setting down her cup and walking to the desk in the corner. She opened an old metal drawer and pulled out a folder. The pages inside were yellowing, clipped from old newspapers, many of them printed on grayish regional sheets. "I remembered something," she said softly, "after what you found at the trailer." She laid the articles on the table, pointing to one in particular. The headline read, "3 Missing in Arkansas. Woman and child among disappeared." The grainy photo beside it showed a woman, Lydia, with a bruise on her cheek and Eli in her arms. "I clipped this 2 years ago. I remember because the story just stopped. No follow-up, no updates. It bothered me." Ben picked up the article, scanning it. "Arkansas. That's over 1,000 miles away." Maeve nodded. "Which means whoever brought him here had time and resources." Eli shuffled closer to Sonny, his hand still buried in the dog's fur. "He had a black car," he said suddenly. "No plates in the front. He always played loud music. It made my head hurt." Ben jotted everything down. He kept his tone neutral, calm, as if talking about weather. "Did you see him when he brought you to the house?" Eli shook his head. "I was in the back. It was dark. He said, 'Be quiet or I'll bury you,' so I didn't say anything." Maeve swallowed visibly. Who hides a child inside a stranger's crawlspace? Ben stood, running a hand through his hair. Someone who knew the house. Someone who thought it would be long before anyone found him, if ever. That night, Ben stayed up late, poring through maps and property records. His house had been built nearly 60 years ago. It had passed through several hands, including one particularly brief owner 6 years ago, a man named Ronald Beeks, who had purchased the home at auction and resold it within 4 months. Ben made a call to Dean Rourke, a former fellow firefighter turned part-time private investigator. Dean was in his late 50s, thick around the middle but sharp as a blade where it counted. He had salt and pepper stubble and a reputation for knowing exactly who to bribe for the right file. Dean picked up on the second ring. "Parker. Damn, it's been a while." "Wish it was a social call," Ben said. "You still have access to DMV records?" Dean grunted. "Off the books? Sure. What are we looking at?" Ben gave him the name Ronald Beeks and everything Eli had said about the car. Black sedan, no front plates, possibly connected to a woman and child who went missing in Arkansas. Dean was quiet for a moment. "You're running into federal territory, Ben." "I know. I'll call you back when I dig something." The next day, Maeve introduced Eli to her neighbor's cat, Thistle, a skittish tabby with one torn ear and a tendency to hide in cupboards. Surprisingly, the cat took to Eli almost instantly. She brushed against his ankles and purred, melting some of the tension in his posture. Watching Eli laugh an awkward, breathy thing, Ben felt something shift. He had been preparing for worst-case scenarios, building mental bunkers. But now, with each new word Eli spoke, with every small bond he formed with Sonny, with Maeve, even with Thistlet, was hope returning in pieces. Later that night, as they sat quietly with the wind brushing against the windows, Eli curled into Sonny's side and whispered, "He won't find me here, right?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He pulled a quilt over the boy and said, "Not while I'm breathing." Chapter 5. Truth in the Shadows. The wind picked up that night, brushing through the tall pines around Maeve's cabin like fingers running through dry grass. The sound was familiar to those who had lived long enough in the Vermont woodsoft, mournful, ancient. But tonight, it felt like a warning. Inside, the fire burned low, casting golden arcs on the walls, and in the silence between its crackles, Ben's phone buzzed. He stepped outside to answer, careful not to wake Eli, who was curled up with Sonny by the hearth, one hand resting gently on the retriever's back. The cold hit Ben instantly sharp, clean, sobering. He held the phone to his ear. "Dean?" "Yeah," came the gravelly reply. "You were right to call me." Dean Rourke's voice was like sandpaper over a campfire lograph, familiar, dependable. Once a firehouse captain like Ben, he'd retired early and pivoted into freelance investigations after his wife passed. Grief had hardened him, but not made him bitter. At 58, Dean was lean and sharp-eyed, with a voice that always sounded like it was trying to cut through smoke. "I ran the name you gave me, Lydia Rowe. She's connected to something bad, Ben. And the boy, Eli? He's one of 3 missing children tied to a suspected trafficking ring based out of Little Rock." Ben gripped the railing. "Trafficking?" "Yeah," Dean continued. "The operation was under investigation by state and federal agencies last year, but it went cold. No witnesses, no trace. All 3 kids vanished within months of each other. But there's more. One of the names tied to the case? Ronald Beeks." Ben's eyes narrowed. "The guy who owned my house?" "Bingo," Dean replied. "Beeks was arrested a few times battery. Possession, but always slipped away on bail. He's got ties to a man named Darren Holt. Holt's a suspected enforcer for the ring. Guess what? Big guy, bald, tattoo on the neck, and drives a black sedan with no front plates." Ben's breath hitched. "That's him. That's who Eli remembers." Dean's tone grew more serious. "If Holt's been near your property, you're not safe. I'd move the kid soon." Ben ended the call with a knot tightening in his chest. The cold air no longer felt sober-injured, felt like a threat. When he stepped back inside, he found Maeve seated at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, her eyes already asking questions. "Dean confirmed it," Ben said. "It's not just a domestic case. It's organized, and it's dangerous." Maeve's face paled. "Does that mean they'll come back?" Ben nodded grimly. "If Holt thinks Eli's still alive, he will." Sonny, who had been lying motionless, suddenly stood, ears perked, body tense. He trotted toward the window and let out a low, warning growl. Ben moved to the curtain and peered through. Headlights, faint, far down the road. "Could just be a neighbor," Maeve said, trying to sound calm. But Sonny's body didn't relax. He backed away from the window and positioned himself between Eli and the front door. Ben didn't waste a second. He grabbed the shotgun Maeve kept under the floorboard, an old 12-gauge she'd used once to scare off a bear. He checked the chamber and set it beside the door. "I'll stay up tonight," he said. Maeve hesitated. "We can't keep the boy here forever." "No," Ben agreed, voice quiet. "But we keep him safe until we figure out what comes next." The next morning, Ben drove to town to meet Dean in person. They met at a gas station on the edge of Millfield, a neutral, quiet place with nothing but a vending machine and an old man named Gordy running the counter. Gordy was in his 70s, stooped and almost toothless, but remembered everyone who ever bought a coffee from him. He gave Ben a nod and handed him a thermos before disappearing into the back room. Dean waited in a beat-up Chevy Impala, eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses. He wore a thick canvas jacket and a hunter's cap pulled low. When Ben climbed into the passenger seat, Dean didn't waste time. "I dug deeper. Holt's been seen upstate last week. That black sedan was caught on a private trail cam in Sandhill County, less than 30 miles from your place." Ben cursed under his breath. "That's too close." "Too close," Dean echoed. "And he doesn't travel without a reason." Ben stared ahead. "What do we do?" Dean leaned back. "I've got an old buddy in state police, someone we can trust. But we need proof. Photos. Video. Something tying Holt to the kid. Otherwise, they'll bury the case again." Ben nodded. "I'll find a way." As Ben drove home through the forest-lined roads, his thoughts were a storm. At one turn, he saw a black pickup parked on the shoulder. No plates in front. Tinted windows. He slowed, watching carefully, but the truck didn't move. That night, Ben rigged an old trail camera outside the cabin. It had once been used for deer, now repurposed for something far more dangerous. He also installed a motion sensor light Maeve had stashed in her garage. Sonny, now unusually alert, paced often at night, whining at odd hours, especially when the wind blew from the north. The tension in the house was palpable, but Alyssa surprisingly was doing better. He spoke more each day, often in whispers, mostly to Sonny or to Thistle, who now slept on his lap as if she'd claimed him. He even helped Maeve make cookies one afternoon, dusting flour on Sonny's nose and letting out a laugh so pure it caught Ben off guard. But none of it changed the fact that Holt was out there, and getting closer. Chapter 6. The Chase in the Snow. The snow had begun to fall in earnest by the time Ben set the final log on the fire. Outside, the wind howled like a warning from the trees, and the flakes swept across Maeve's front porch in frantic, swirling gusts. It had been a long day, filled with false calm and the kind of silence that feels too deliberate. Eli had spent most of it drawing in the corner of the living room, sketching dogs with floppy ears and wide eyes. Maeve busied herself with soup, her hands shaking slightly as she stirred. Ben noticed, but didn't comment. Sonny had grown increasingly restless. He wouldn't settle for long, pacing between the windows and the door, his ears twitching at every sound. At first, Ben chalked it up to cabin fever, but when Sonny let out a low growl near the back entrance, all thoughts of coincidence vanished. Ben moved to the door and switched off the inside lights. He motioned to Maeve, who immediately understood and pulled Eli toward the pantry without a word. Ben eased the curtain aside and scanned the snow-covered yard. For a moment, nothing. Then, movement barely noticeable. A shadow shifted by the tree line, too large to be wildlife. Ben cursed under his breath. He grabbed the shotgun from beneath the coat rack and checked the chamber. Then he opened the trapdoor to the storm cellar beneath the pantry floor. "We have to go, now," he whispered, not waiting for questions. Maeve helped Eli climb down first, wrapping him in her thick winter coat. The boy's eyes were wide but silent, lips pressed tight. Sonny followed him down, tail stiff, his entire body coiled like a spring. Maeve was next, her joints stiff from age, but determination braced her like armor. Ben lowered the door slowly and bolted it from above. He sprinted through the back hall, grabbing the emergency bag he had packed days earlier: water, first aid, cash, keys. He slung it over his shoulder and followed the others down into the cellar. The cold was immediate, biting at the skin like broken glass. Maeve lit a small lantern, its glow casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. A narrow tunnel extended out the back of the cellar, a relic from the old bootlegging days when the house had belonged to her grandfather. It opened half a mile into the woods, hidden behind a thicket of evergreens. They moved quickly. Eli clung to Maeve's side, her arm wrapped protectively around him. Sonny led the way, his nose low, ears high, body moving with practiced caution. Ben brought up the rear, every step deliberate, listening for the crunch of snow that wasn't theirs. Halfway through the tunnel, they heard it. The back door upstairs had splintered. Whoever they were inside now. Ben hissed, "Faster." The wind screamed as they emerged from the tunnel into the open woods. Snow fell in curtains, thick and blinding. The storm had arrived in full force. Visibility dropped to barely 10 feet, and their only guide was Sonny, who moved confidently ahead, choosing paths that cut through drifts and between trees like he had walked them all his life. Behind them, voices shouts muffled by the storm. At least 2, maybe 3 men. Heavy footsteps crunched in the snow, off rhythm with their own. "Keep moving," Ben shouted over the wind. Maeve, despite her age, trudged forward without hesitation, teeth clenched. Eli slipped once, his tiny hands scraping against a rock. Sonny doubled back, licking the wound before nudging him forward again. Then came the shot. A crack echoed through the woodsharp, brutal. Ben turned just in time to see a puff of snow explode near a tree inches from his shoulder. "Get down!" he yelled, tackling Maeve and Eli behind a fallen log. Sonny darted ahead, disappearing into the white blur, then returned a second later, barking sharply. He had found another path. They scrambled after him, hearts pounding. Ben covered their rear, shotgun raised, scanning the trees. More shots rang out 2 quick bursts. Branches snapped behind them. Whoever these men were, they weren't just chasing. They were hunting. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the trees thinned, revealing an old ranger cabin abandoned, boarded up, but standing. Ben recognized it from an old hiking map. He kicked the door in with one blow, ushered everyone inside, and dragged a shelf across the entryway. The place smelled of rot and mold, Broken furniture lay scattered, and the fireplace was nothing but bricks and ashes. But it was shelter. Maeve collapsed onto a chair, gasping. Eli huddled with Sonny in the corner, both of them shaking. Ben stood at the window, peering through a cracked board, shotgun at the ready. The woods had gone still. Not quiet still. Maeve finally spoke. "We can't outrun them forever." "No," Ben agreed. "But we can make it hard." Sonny growled low. Then something outside snapped. Ben raised the shotgun, aimed into the dark. But nothing came. Instead, there was silence followed by retreating footsteps. Their pursuers had given up. For now. Ben didn't relax. He wouldn't. He watched the darkness long after the snow began to ease, and somewhere between exhaustion and vigilance, he promised himself they would not take that child. Not tonight. Not ever. Chapter 7. The Cabin of Light. By the time the snowstorm began to wane, the world outside the ranger cabin had turned to a frozen silence, broken only by the wind nudging through the eaves and Sonny's soft breathing near the door. Dawn had not yet arrived, but the night was no longer pitch-black pale moonlight filtered through the broken slats, silvering the frost that coated every surface. Inside, the old cabin held warmth not from the fireless hearth, but from the quiet unity of those who had weathered the storm together. Ben stood at the window, his back aching from hours of stillness. His breath clouded in the chill air as he listened for any sound of return. Nothing. The pursuers were gone for now. Maeve sat wrapped in a wool blanket on the old cot, her face pale but composed, her eyes trained on Eli, who had fallen asleep with Sonny curled around him like a guardian halo of gold. "We need to move before noon," Ben said softly, not turning around. "The roads might be clear by then. I know a place higher up the ridge a cabin we used for fire training years ago. It's remote. Safer than here." Maeve nodded. "How far?" "About 4 miles. Snowshoes, if we need them." "Then we'd better eat what's left," she said, standing with a quiet groan and making her way to their packs. By midday, the group was on the move. The clouds had lifted, revealing a crystalline sky, sharp and bright. The snow sparkled under the winter sun, untouched and unwelcoming. Ben carried most of the supplies. Maeve followed with steady, short steps, and Eli clung to Sonny's leash, the dog marching proudly at the lead as if sensing he had a mission to finish. It took them nearly 3 hours to reach the cabin. It stood alone at the edge of a bluff, its chimney leaning slightly and the roof sagging in places, but the structure remained sound. The cabin had been built by the state decades ago, used as a lookout post and later converted into a fire training site. Ben remembered the way it smelled of smoke and pine, of sweat and determination. Inside, the air was dry and still. Dust clung to the windows, and a row of old bunk beds lined the far wall. A heavy wood stove sat in the center, surrounded by storage shelves that, to their surprise, still held canned goods and dried food. Eli's face lit up the moment they stepped inside. He ran toward the bunk beds, his boots clunking on the wooden floor. "It's warm," he said. "It smells like Grandpa's garage." Maeve smiled and ruffled his hair. "Then it's perfect." That evening, with the stove roaring and the scent of beans and cornbread filling the space, a sense of peace crept in. For the first time in days, Ben let himself sit down without a weapon within reach. He watched as Eli played with Sonny, using a scrap of rope as a makeshift tug toy. The boy's laughter echoed through the wooden beams, real and full, not the fractured sound of trauma Ben had grown used to. Maeve, wrapped in a hand-knit shawl she'd packed long ago, stirred the pot over the stove. "He's healing," she said quietly. "Yeah," Ben replied. "We all are. A little." Just before dusk, Ben stepped outside to check for any tracks on the fresh snow. The wind had cleared most of the old trails, and nothing seemed disturbed. The forest was quiet in that strange way that only snow makes possible a silence so complete it hums. That's when the satellite phone rang. Ben answered immediately. "Dean?" "Got news," Dean said, his voice sharp with urgency but undercut by relief. "They caught him, Holt. He was trying to cross the border into Quebec with a forged passport. Canadian border agents flagged the prince." Ben let out a slow breath, shoulders sagging. "Are you sure it's him?" "Positive. He's in custody." Feds are involved now. They're working on connecting him to the missing children cases, and they've got enough to hold him. They're sending agents your way should arrive tomorrow morning by helicopter. Ben stared out across the snow-covered treetops, emotions swirling in his chest. That's it then? Dean was quiet. No, but it's the beginning of the end. When Ben returned inside, Maeve looked up, reading the news in his expression before he even spoke. He gave her a small nod, and she exhaled, setting her spoon down and closing her eyes. Eli noticed the shift in the room and looked up. Did something happen? Ben knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. They caught the man who hurt your mom. He won't ever find you again. Eli stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Ben's face for any flicker of doubt. Then he leaned forward and hugged him tightly, his small arms wrapping around Ben's neck. Sonny barked once, as if echoing the relief. That night, with the stove crackling and the shadows soft against the walls, Eli fell asleep in one of the bunks, clutching Sonny like a stuffed toy. Maeve sat in a rocker near the fire, knitting by lantern light, and Ben stood at the window, looking out into the woods one last time, no longer watching for shadows, but for morning. Chapter 8. A Brighter Tomorrow. Spring came slowly to Vermont, melting the harsh edges of winter one golden morning at a time. The snow receded from the hills like a tide, revealing the deep green of pine needles and the stubborn brown of earth waking from frost. The sun rose earlier now, casting long, soft shadows through the windows of the small cabin where Eli had once hidden from the world. Now, that cabin sat quiet again, but it was not a place of fear anymore. It had become a Markera boundary between before and after. Eli had changed. The boy who once spoke in whispers and flinched at footsteps now laughed freely, with a brightness in his eyes that had been absent for too long. His cheeks were fuller, his step quicker. His drawings, once dark with jagged edges, were now full of color. Trees with fat birds, dogs that smiled, suns with wide golden halos. After federal agents arrived by helicopter the morning following Holt's arrest, things moved fast. Maeve stayed by Eli's side while Ben gave his statement. The agents, professionally kind, dressed in dark jackets and quiet boots, took Holt's files, gathered evidence, and made promises that felt more like beginnings than conclusions. Eli, in the days that followed, was placed into temporary care with Thomas and Marlene Whitmore, a couple who had lived in Millfield for nearly 2 decades. Thomas was a retired forest ranger, tall with kind blue eyes and hands that always smelled like cedar. His wife Marlene was shorter, round-shouldered, with silver hair pinned in a careful bun and a voice like warm buttered cornbread, gentle and grounding. They had never had children of their own. After years of trying and one devastating miscarriage, they'd stopped, but their hearts had never closed. Marlene ran the town's used bookstore, and Thomas spent his days tending the trails and teaching kids about animal tracks and wild berries. When asked if they'd be willing to foster Eli, they didn't hesitate. The first time Eli stepped into their home, he froze at the threshold, gripping Sonny's leash tighter. Marlene knelt to his level, smiling softly. "There's no locks here, sweetheart. Just books and pie." He nodded slowly and walked inside. Over the weeks that followed, Eli began calling their house the place with the cherry tree. He helped Thomas build a birdhouse, learned to make pancakes with Marlene, and insisted that Sonny visit at least once a week. Sonny, for his part, adjusted, instantly padding through the Whitmore's kitchen like he'd been there his whole life. Ben returned to his house on the edge of town. He fixed the back door, reinforced the crawl space, and built a new wooden bench out front, the kind with curved arms and a weatherproof finish. Maeve gifted him a cushion for it, embroidered with the words, "Safe, Still." She too returned to her rhythms, walking into town with baskets of herbs, her silver braid swinging like a bell rope behind her. But it wasn't all the same. The people of Millfield had changed too. When word spread first in hushed voices at the diner, then in wider circles that Sonny had helped uncover a lost child, the town gathered, not for spectacle, but for gratitude. At a small spring festival held on the town green, Sonny was brought forward on a leash strung with ribbons, his golden coat gleaming under the late March sun. Children clapped, and older women wiped tears from their cheeks. Mayor Cynthia Dale, A tall woman with a commanding presence and a closet full of brightly colored scarves presented Sunny with a medal that read, "Silent Hero of Millfield." "Sometimes," she said, addressing the crowd, "courage doesn't bark. It listens. It waits. It knows. And then it saves." Ben, standing beside his old friend, rested a hand on Sunny's back. The dog looked up at him with that familiar gaze, full of understanding. No fanfare needed, just loyalty. Later that day, Ben took Sunny to visit Eli. The boy was in the backyard, seated on a quilt beneath the cherry tree. He was painting watercolors spread across a tray beside him. When he saw them, he jumped to his feet, arms wide. "Sunny!" The dog bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously. Ben smiled as he approached. "You been behaving for the Whitmores?" Eli nodded, hugging Sunny. "I helped Marlene prune the roses, and I didn't cry when I went to the dentist." "That's brave," Ben said, ruffling his hair. They sat under the tree for a while, talking about little things pancake flavors, bird names, whether clouds could ever fall. Ben watched Eli speak, watched how his eyes stayed up, not down. How he laughed from the belly now, not from the throat. He was healing, not just surviving. At some point, Eli grew quiet, glancing at Ben with a more serious look. "Will you always come visit?" "Always," Ben promised. "You'll never be alone again." Eli looked at Sunny, who had now flopped onto his side, panting happily. "He saved me." Ben nodded. He did. And as the cherry blossoms began to open above them, pale pinks against soft blue, Eli leaned back and said, "I think I'm going to be okay." Ben didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sometimes, the smallest voices call to us from the deepest shadows, and it takes a brave heart to listen. What did this story awaken in you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your heart.